Okay, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who are looking for decentralized Drupal, the decoupled Drupal endgame, you are in the right room. If you are looking for a different session, such as about what Drupal can do today, this is not that session. Let me just start a stopwatch here. Great. How's everybody doing today? Good? Wie geht's? Alles gut? Well, welcome, herzlich willkommen, and welcome to this session today. My name is Preston So. I am the Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia, where I also lead up our Acquia Labs division. And many of you might know me from a lot of the talks I've given in the past about decoupled Drupal and direct applications of how you can do some really amazing things with Drupal on the front end. A couple of notes. I do run a team of innovators and tinkerers and experimenters in Acquia called Acquia Labs. If you're looking for some help with projects involving things like the blockchain, involving things like AR, VR, involving things like voice assistants, we have a team that's prepared to help you with that project. Also, one note I did want to make is that just a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago, we had the Decoupled Drupal Days conference in New York City. All of the session videos are online if you would like to check those out, and if you're interested in some of these ideas around decoupled Drupal. We will be doing it again next year, I promise you that. We're working out the venue right now, so that will be announced soon. But in the meantime, if you want to check out some of the videos, feel free to see some of the content that we've got. I also want to do my due diligence here and thank Platform SH, which is the sponsor of the Drupal and Technology track today. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? And I'm going to stress this once more. I am not going to be talking today about what Drupal does today or what Drupal will do in the near future. I actually might not even be talking about what Drupal is capable of in the next 5 years. But I want to introduce a concept that is relatively new to many of us in the room, but has taken a lot of the old web pioneers by storm in recent years. And that is the decentralized web. First thing I'll do is I'll talk about how the web is broken today and how Drupal fits into that picture. I'll talk about some of the ways that we as a community and we as a software project really work with these concepts of decentralization. And what does decentralization really mean? I'll talk about the decentralized web, what exactly that means, what exactly is that relationship with Drupal. And then I'll talk about what a decentralized Drupal might look like. And the reason why I called this session the decoupled Drupal endgame is because I think, and I believe very strongly, that this process of decoupling Drupal that we have undertaken quite a bit in recent years is only the first step in a series of steps that we as a community can take to ensure Drupal's future in the long run. And I'll talk about some of the ways that decentralizing Drupal can make that happen, not just for our software and not just for how we build our projects, but also the future of our community and the future of contribution. I live in New York City. I am a resident of Brooklyn. And oftentimes, one of the things that you'll find in Brooklyn is very intelligent, or at least very in-the-moment graffiti that reflects the zeitgeist of today. And one example is this right here. I pass by this graffiti actually every morning when I go to the office on the subway. And I've always thought about this quote. And it's really interesting because I did a little bit of research on this graffiti artist. And it turns out that this artist has many other examples of this kind of graffiti. And as you can see here, this one says, decentralize everything. Decentralize everything, meaning decentralizing all of the things that create the power structures today in our society that are harmful or oppressive. Now, he's got some other ideas that I might not necessarily agree with. I don't know necessarily that Bitcoin is the future. I don't know necessarily that blockchain is the future. And I do want to stress that the decentralized web as a concept does not necessarily rely on or depend on blockchain. But as you can see, one of the really interesting things about this graffiti artist, Gatse, is that this person really is focused on this idea of how this idea of decentralization, if we apply it to society, if we apply it to the way that the world works, can tear apart all of the systems that create oppression today. Now, what's a good example of this? The first, of course, is the web. And one of the things that the late Sir Stephen Hawking said that I find very interesting as a quote is, we are now all connected by the internet, like neurons in a giant brain. And what exactly does that mean? Well, if you think about the big tech companies right now, the classic GAFA companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, together these four massive companies control a colossal amount of our personal data and our personal information. And as the Cambridge Analytica scandal and as several other scandals have proven, most recently British Airways, for example, our data is not secure. Our data is not protected in the ways that we truly need to feel private and secure and have the actual things that we want to experience. And I think that when you look at folks like Mark Zuckerberg, whose prerogative is really to take this data and sell it, to figure out ways to apply machine learning to this data and sell it to other companies. Or if you think about the fact that Amazon Echo, our favorite Alexa, was recently found to be surreptitiously recording certain conversations and sending them to people without the consent of the users of these products, you can tell that our data is in a very precarious position. We have to be very worried about where our data goes, and we have to be very worried about what people do with our data. Now, what's interesting is that if you think about the early history of the web, the promise of the early web was actually this idea of decentralization. It was primarily focused on this idea of having everyone who has their data have the control over their data. But our data today is increasingly being intermediated and controlled by these private companies that have absolutely no business in helping us protect our data. And they have absolutely no revenue-based prerogative to do any sort of protection of the information that we provide. If you think about web prehistory, if you think about the way that the web worked in the early 90s, there were a lot of technologies like Archie, Gopher, FTP, and these systems allowed us to create a massive amount of information trees and information linkages across academic resources. But this was still part of a closed elite, and it was a very good example of this centralization of control. But in the early days, people saw this as a problem, and they said, we need to democratize and decentralize the web itself. And the open web, if you look at how it looked in the early 90s, was really characterized by this intrinsic freedom of expression, this intrinsic idea of liberty. And if you look at folks like Larry Lessig, he actually cites TCP/IP as an example of code that provides an inherent protection for free expression. There's no way for us to lock down TCP/IP. And indeed, Brewster Kahle, another web pioneer, his main goal from the very beginning has been to figure out how we can, through software, lock open the web and ensure that there are no walled gardens or issues around privacy. And we still have examples of this today. If you consider the fact that anyone can start a website, anyone can start up a blog, they can edit Wikipedia, you have hyperlocal media, hyperlocal news sites that allow us to be able to really feel like we have the ability to influence the web ourselves and not have it be controlled by these big tech giants. And John Perry Barlow, in his Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, said this: "We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere, may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity." And the promise of the web was this. It was that open web idea, that idea of democratization and openness. And one of the main ideas of this open web was the concept of a distributed architecture. Many people could have their own servers in their own closets. Many people could have their own hosting companies or small businesses that would host different sites that people built. And people recognized that by empowering users to do those things on their own, to host their own servers, to have their own websites and host them themselves on their own servers, was a means to create an open web. Is it possible to go back to those days? Is it possible for us to go there? Well, of course, advertising suggests that it's not. And Ethan Zuckerman, who's one of the primary promulgators of the decentralized web, says that advertising is the original sin of the web. And if you think about it, right now, And this is as of 2 years ago. It's probably even more right now. But in 2016, 85 cents of every dollar spent on advertising on the web went to just 2 companies, Google and Facebook. What are some of the risks of this centralization that we're experiencing right now? If you consider the fact that right now, these 4 companies control a colossal amount of data. Consider the fact, for instance, that Google recently announced, to great controversy, that they would open a Chinese censored version to be able to enter the People's Republic of China and that market. That creates an example of top-down direct censorship. Or consider the fact that these companies have created situations and conditions where folks can be biased in the news that they receive. We have instances of fake news. There's instances like InfoWars, for example, peddling in these conspiracy theories. And of course, also exclusion. When Facebook, for example, implements a must-have name policy, what does that do for political dissidents and those who cannot be publicly themselves? Consider that curatorial bias creates a situation where we have political polarization today. And it's because of the actions of these companies, or inaction therein, that causes some of these issues to surface. Consider, for example, that there are many folks in the LGBTQ community who cannot use their full names because of the illegality of such things in their own country. And consider the fact that Facebook is now requiring everyone to use their real name. What does that do? What danger does that create? At the Decentralized Web Summit last year, Tim Berners-Lee said something very interesting, which is that you can make the walled garden, of course the walled garden being GAFA, these big tech companies, you can make them very, very sweet, but the jungle outside is always more appealing in the long term. There are many of us who have left Facebook, who have left Twitter in favor of tools like Mastodon, or who have left Facebook in favor of our own blogging tools based on Drupal or on WordPress, because we know that outside of it, outside of this whole sphere, there's a lot more that's possible. So how does Drupal fit into this whole paradigm? Well, we're actually very lucky as a community because decoupled Drupal is a very good example. It's an exemplar of how a lot of these software projects are beginning to consider how they might begin this process of decentralization. For example, consider the fact that when you are decoupling Drupal, the data that you are using on the consumer side is never actually coupled to the front-end application. For example, when I serve data to my React application, that data is not controlled by React. It's still fundamentally controlled by Drupal. Or it's housed in client-side storage temporarily, of course. And with API First, we are creating a means for anyone to be able to speak the language of Drupal. And this is very similar to the Solid project, which is led by Tim Berners-Lee and aims to provide a way for us to have linked data across many different systems that we ourselves can control on the client side. Consider the fact that decoupled architectures point to much greater flexibility. And also consider the fact that today, if you think about the way that a decoupled architecture works truly in the real world, we have many different consumers that we have to serve in our technology ecosystem, in our kind of content ecosystem that we're building, our data ecosystem that we have. Now, the big question with decoupled Drupal, however, is how do we know how and where our data is being utilized? This is a very important question. And some of the modules that we see today in the community do have some answers to this question. If you look, for example, at Simple OAuth and OAuth 2.0 and how that authentication method works right now, decoupled Drupal, there is a direct relationship between a user on Drupal and the consumer that it's tied to. So you can say, for example, I want my Swift application to be a consumer that has administrative privileges, but I only want my particular group of applications over here that are my mobile apps or my JavaScript applications to have read-only access. But is that truly granular enough? Is that something that is flexible enough? Because consider the fact that once we actually grant those permissions, there is no way to really truly know what data is being used and how that data is actually moving across the various applications that we're building on the consumer side. There is no way to truly know, even with these authentication methods that we now have in the context of decoupled Drupal. So what's very clear is that Drupal's roles and permission system is actually not granular enough. It doesn't provide enough of that ability for us to determine where exactly our data is ending up. In this figure that you see here, in this diagram, we have Drupal, and this green border is the web services that are exposing that data out to these different consumers. But we know that right now, we can't just give a full-blown administered content permission to all of these things, because we want to have a distinction between the ways that these two things actually interact with each other. So I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but I want to talk about another example of decentralization that I think is very relevant to us as a community. And this is an interesting kind of focus point, because when you think about how we are different from Google I/O or some of these other large conferences, it is our community. It is the fact that we have the ability to work with people from 5 time zones away or across language barriers. We do have our own decentralized community. Our core is this decentralized community. We believe in this idea of decentralized action, that anyone can contribute from anywhere, whether you're in New Zealand or whether you're in India or whether you're in Finland. All of these things can happen. And we all share the same goal of having this take place. And one other thing is that we all value privacy. As recent episodes in the Drupal community have shown, we take our privacy very seriously. We do not want certain aspects of our lives to be spread willy-nilly across the web. But the question that we have to ask ourselves as the world evolves and as things change in the technology landscape is, are we doing as good of a job protecting the data of users of our software as we do our very own? Because if you think about the fact that Drupal security vulnerabilities allow anyone to have complete root access, for example, to these data that people are putting into our sites, how do we prevent that from becoming such a big danger as it is today? So I want to say this, which is we should apply the same principles of decentralization, not only of how we do open source today, not only how we value our privacy, not only how we work with decoupled Drupal architectures, we should apply that to the internals of our own software itself. And this is probably where you're saying, okay, now you're right about the fact that this is not going to happen in the next 5 years in Drupal. But first, let's really quickly define a couple of concepts. The decentralized web is a movement that is led by some of the big pioneers in the early open web, like Tim Berners-Lee, Brewster Kahle, some of these very heavyweight folks who have been very influential in the way that the web worked initially. And there's 2 major concepts in the decentralized web movement that are extremely important to understanding how this vision works. And I want to quote this directly. By distributing data, processing and hosting across millions of computers worldwide with no centralized control, a new decentralized web has the potential to be open, empowering users around the globe to better control and protect their own personal data. The decentralized web movement is focused on this idea of re-decentralizing the web, bringing it back to the old days, where everyone had their own server in their closet, where everyone had their own blog, where everyone felt free to express themselves and weren't limited to these ecosystems that are highly restrictive. The decentralized web aims to disintermediate this private data so that we take it out of the claws of these big tech companies and restore our sovereignty over our own data. And if you think about it, this is an idea that makes a lot of sense. It's actually something that is really, when you think about it, our users today of these large companies have been completely swindled into giving their data up to these companies and not knowing where it's going to end up. But we can take that back, and we can think about how this could work. And there's 2 things that really are important components of the decentralized web stack, or the decentralized web technology landscape. The first is data portability. When I produce some kind of content, or I do a like on Facebook, or I share some piece of content, or I upload an image to Flickr, I should be able to take that data and rescind access to that data at any point in time. I should be able to go and say, you know what, I actually don't want this website or this company to have access to this image. And right now, we're already on the way there. We have the ability to decouple data from applications such that the data is not controlled by those applications that we're actually exposing that data to. The second central tenet is this idea of distributed computing. And this is where things get a little trickier, because it does demand a little bit more of that impetus from the user themselves to actually have a node on this network, a node on this distributed network of computing resources. But what this does is it prevents a single point of failure, and it prevents a concentration of control. Because right now, all of our data just goes to Facebook servers, and it lies there for years on end. But if we can control our data, everything changes. Now, there's three really influential thinkers in the decentralized web, Chelsea Barabbas, Neha Narula, and Ethan Zuckerman, who have written a very interesting paper that I highly recommend for those of you who are interested in the decentralized web. And there's a couple of problems. The first is adoption. We have to make sure that our experiences that we create, whether they're setting up a new server or whether it's the user experience of having this self-sovereign data, they have to be really good. And they have to be as good as, if not better than, the current big tech experiences that we're fighting against today. And then the second thing is, how do we actually build applications that are usable but also secure in the ways that we want them to be? And I'm going to take a little bit of an aside here to talk briefly about blockchain. But one thing that I want to stress is that blockchain and decentralized web are two adjacent concepts. Many people have argued, and this is a case that happened during the Decentralized Web Summit just this past year, there's been a lot of discussion about whether we actually need blockchain in the first place to do any of these things. And I argue that perhaps not. And I'll talk about a couple of those use cases in a bit. But blockchain is a very interesting application of this, because the whole idea is to decentralize trust and to provide a singular digital memory with self-sovereign data that allows for anybody to know exactly where their data is going. It's great for authentication and great for protecting identities. But once again, blockchain and decentralization are adjacent concepts. They're not necessarily part of the same thing. But I did want to mention that very briefly, because many of the sessions here this week, for example, Drupal and the Ethereum blockchain, a couple of other sessions about blockchain this week, do talk about this idea. But I think the decentralized web is actually bigger than that. And I think that we can do some of these things without necessarily having to enter into that ecosystem. Because the full idea of the decentralized web rests on APIs and rests on interoperability. The decentralized web is going to require new protocols, new standards, new architectures, new libraries. We do have to spin up all of these things from scratch. And there's also three paradigm shifts that one of the thinkers on this subject that I respect the most, Rubbe Verborg, he's at the University of Ghent, stated last year, which are end users become data owners, apps become views, and interfaces become queries. For those of you who have worked with GraphQL, for instance, this third one will be very, very familiar to you. One of the things that Verborg argues for is this idea of having data pods. And this is the exact idea of having all of your data stored locally on your own server. And it has extremely granular permissions in terms of how you can use that data and where it goes. But of course, scalability is an issue here. And I do want to stress here that a lot of these ideas are very new. A lot of these ideas are very rough, immature. And my goal today is not to provide a clean-cut vision of the way that this could go. It's to begin a discussion. It's to begin some thinking around this and some imagination that we can conduct together. Now, what he says is that in a fully decentralized way of thinking, everything that you post, everything that you create, all of your data is stored on your own website or server. So, for example, if you like a page on Facebook, you can decide who that like is shown to in a very granular way. You can say, well, I only want, let's say, this segment of users or this segment of applications through Facebook Connect to have access to this like. The second is, and this is something that we already have in Drupal, in decoupled Drupal architectures today, is that rather than having this idea that all of the data will be housed in the applications that we are serving to, these apps become just views. They become flat views, they're read-only, and if they need to get updates or if they need to get new information, they have to go back to these data pods. Third, interfaces become queries. In order for us to create these user interfaces and these applications, now we're going to write declarative queries instead that aim to provide access to all of these data pods in a very easy way. And as you can see, this is going to require a whole lot of standardization that today does not exist. Now, there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with in terms of how people are thinking right now about the decentralized web. But one thing I do agree with is these three things. I do believe that this is a very accurate depiction of how things will need to go for this to succeed. I highly recommend you read that article, by the way. It's very good. So let's stop talking about these platitudes and these elevated, lofty ideals, and let's talk about how this would actually work and how this would actually look in Drupal. What would a hypothetical decentralized Drupal look like? The first thing is something that Lauri Escola and I said in Lisbon, which is that one of the first things that we'll need to do is to decouple Drupal out of the box. And I'll explain very comprehensively why that is in a little bit. Because there's two different figments that we have to aim for as we build a hypothetical decentralized Drupal. The first is the external side. When we serve data to these consumers, our APIs have to be able to decorate those responses with a very clear idea of what permissions that consumer application has access to. And it also has to be very clear about when that information grant expires, and also how to retrieve a new piece of data that updates that view. Internally, it's the same story. Many of us still build Drupal websites that are monolithic and not decoupled. Many of us still deal with traditional site building implementations and traditional Drupal architectures. But we have to enhance that with a data gatekeeping system that allows for different components of Drupal to have more localized and more granular permissioning of data. So what does that look like? We should be able to determine two things. The first is, where does our data end up on the consumer side? Which application has access to which data? And secondly, which parts of Drupal can use that data and have access to it? So let's talk first about the consumer side. What does decentralizing Drupal look like when it comes to decoupled Drupal architectures where the front ends are completely different? And let's take a case where we have an architecture that looks something like this. We have a couple of read-only consumers that we know that we want to serve data to. And those could be things like digital signs, those could be things like information kiosks, or perhaps in-flight entertainment systems, whatever you want. But the second category of consumers that we have, and many people are actually doing this kind of architecture right now today, might be editorial interfaces. And you're probably thinking, well, voice assistants. There are actually cases of people using Amazon Echo to perform edits on Drupal. Right now, if you consider the fact that we have these two different types of consumers of this data, we have a single permission that allows for all of these applications to read the data and retrieve the data that we have on Drupal. That's, of course, the view published content permission right now in Drupal today. But the problem is that Drupal's roles and permission system right now is not quite granular enough. And I want to show really why that is. Because we might want our data to go to only certain places and end up in only certain consumers. And one example of this, for example, is if we want to have field level permissioning that exists today, yes, but we want to make sure that the consumers also recognize and know about that field level permissioning. For example, if you have two editorial interfaces, you might want to distinguish, well, I only want this consumer to affect these fields on a node, and I want these other consumers to access these fields on the node, but I don't want everyone to be able to access every single field in the node and manipulate it. Same thing with user information as well. Perhaps we only want certain aspects of that user profile to be editable on these editorial interfaces on the consumer. So that's an example of how we might need to figure out ways to make our permissioning system much more granular. And I know it's really kind of a tough proposition because already right now we have a huge sea of checkboxes whenever we go to the user roles and permissions page. And this is something that we'll have to think about and really ponder over the course of the next few years. I want to propose a new Drupal manifesto for how Drupal works inside, interiorly, which is, let me take my data where I want within Drupal, or of course in the consumers, and rescind access to it at any time, and grant access to it at any time. Consider this scenario where we have the ability to have Drupal become distinct services that all interoperate with one another, that all communicate with one another, and have their own distinct web services that work together. Consider the fact that I want to have my information that I've put into Drupal available for views, but not through REST, because I want my site builders or my content editors who are working internally in Drupal to see that information, but not have that information go to REST. And also data portability. I should be able to take my data and take it anywhere I want to. I should be able to take it and say, I want to take it to WordPress instead, or I want to take it to some hypothetical other CMS in the future without losing any of it because of the lock-in that it presents. So what I'm arguing in this case is that the same granularity that I've argued for just now externally should apply internally to Drupal itself as well. So let's zoom into Drupal here and look at how this might look. Consider Verborg's concept of data pods. Now, these data pods would need to be located on our own personal servers, on our own local machines that have the ability also to have an API around them that others can communicate with. The central piece of what Drupal is able to do is this data arbitrage, this data gatekeeping, meaning that based on what comes out from these local data pods that we have and we have full control over, Drupal then determines where, in fact, that information can go. So consider this, for example. In my local data pod, I have a series of 3 pieces of content that I can put anywhere. I can put them on Facebook, I can put them on WordPress, I can put them on Drupal, but I have some idea of how I want these things to work within Drupal. For example, I want only my articles to be available to REST, or my images, but I don't want certain other pieces of content to be available to REST, and also, by extension, to these consumers. And we should be able to add and remove these services at will, and say, well, if we don't need REST, if we don't actually need to have this be there, we can go ahead and take it out. Now, once again, I want to stress here that this is all hypothetical, right? This is clearly not how Drupal will work in the near future. But it is a possible way that we could think about taking Drupal in the long run. Some of you have probably thought at this point, well, this sounds a heck of a lot like small core. This sounds a heck of a lot like things that we have thought about over the course of decades in Drupal, and it's true. It is true. But what I'm arguing for also is that we include this idea of having local data management as well, having this ability for us to control and manipulate the way that our data eventually ends up. And that is the decentralized factor that we have at play here. Because the fact of the matter is, if we store our data anywhere else besides our own network node, our own place, our own server, ultimately, we do not have 100% control over it. Some database, some MySQL database or some MongoDB database is going to have that data. Now, there's a couple of different things that could happen in this regard that really show the promise of this kind of approach, or show the value of this kind of approach. And that is, for instance, protecting the rights of content authors. One of the biggest problems that people face today in the web is the inability to control where their content ends up. You see this happen all the time. You do a reverse image search on any image, and you find it on 50 different sites, and none of those sites have actually paid for any royalties on that image to the original photographer. So consider that this kind of approach allows us to actually track, if we were to add a ledger to this, have records of how that content is used that prevent content from being used where it might be embargoed or sensitive, and you can see where this goes. You can see that people will be able to control and enforce copyright or embargo content in a very rich way, or make sure that they receive these royalties. And that's one example of how we could apply blockchain to include this as well. There's also other side effects as well of this idea of decentralization that I want to discuss here. And I know that I've focused a lot on the components of Drupal and the ideas of how we can decentralize Drupal itself. But I also want to talk about how some of these ideas can actually serve to advance some of the problems that we have in our community today. For example, one of the issues that many people have right now is the idea of code bounties, or the idea of unpaid contribution. This is a very significant and severe problem right now in open source at large. Many people are saying that open source is actually a dying paradigm because of the fact that we are not able to have the ability to be compensated for our code. And if we do want to apply that same idea of content rights, one of the big issues that we have today is that attributing these contributions and having the idea of being able to serve certain code and know that that usage of that code will eventually compensate those authors is a very important concept as well. And it's something that a lot of people have talked about in the blockchain community. But of course, this doesn't answer the question of how we track some of the non-code contributions, the same issues that we have right now with crediting issues and contribution attribution today, in terms of how we actually determine how those things are valued. And there's a way that we can imagine introducing a mechanism on Drupal.org, for instance, to track how those contributions are used and how these pieces of code are leveraged to be able to compensate contributors based on the value of what they have ended up contributing. Of course, this does present a lot of issues. That's only one example. And there are many other examples of how we can take this model of decentralization, apply it not only to the architecture of Drupal itself, not only to how we approach decoupled Drupal architectures, but also how we approach our community as well, and how we ensure the future of Drupal at large. I want to end with a few thoughts related to this idea. Now, a lot of these ideas that I presented today are extremely half-baked, and I know I'm going to get a torrent of criticism right now, and a lot of incredulity from the audience. But my goal today was really to examine what's happening around us and think about the fact that we've been late to adopt some of these paradigms that are taking the world by storm. Decoupled Drupal, for instance, and having web services. We had that idea initially, but a lot of the other things that we've thought about in terms of microservices-based architectures at large in the software community are things that we haven't really yet applied to Drupal itself, are things that we haven't thought about in the context of how Drupal operates today. And I want to argue, perhaps not overly forcefully, but certainly suggest that this is a trend that we could certainly get ahead of as a community. Because when you think about it, we are all advocates of this open web. All of us here as open source users and open source contributors, we know that these ideals are important, and we know that big tech is really not a good influence. Because one of the things I want all of us to consider today is that the people who are kids today, who are using Snapchat, who are using Instagram, definitely not Facebook, because they're too young, that's for old people. They have never known, and they may never know what the open web was like to begin with. They may never understand the idea of having their data be controlled by them and not by these monstrosities that are giving our data out willy-nilly. The decentralized web movement is about adhering to those open web principles once more. It's about a return to those ideas and a return to some of the principles that made the web so amazing in the first place. And as we know, Drupal was built on the open web. The whole idea of Drupal is centered on the idea of this open web. And why should we not play a role in this newly decentralized web? Why shouldn't we be a leading pioneer in this new paradigm? And so I want to end with this question, which is, of course, related to everything that I've said so far, and is once again also a hypothetical question, which is, should Drupal be decentralized? And should it really aim to focus on how it exposes data and how it handles it? And should we retake control and have more of that ability to influence where our data ends up and control that ourselves? With that, I want to say thank you. But first, before I go to questions and comments, and I do want to hear comments from the audience and just general thoughts on this, there's a contribution day on Friday. If you would like to join, starting at 9 a.m., there's going to be a first-timers workshop, mentored contribution, and general contribution. I know many of the folks in this room will be there and are very excited to help you with your own contributions to Drupal. And with that, vielen Dank, thank you, and I will now take questions and comments. Thank you. I think we also have a mic here for questions and comments.
Hey, Preston.
Hey, Chris.
Okay, so whole lot of interesting points in there. But like, we've had this notion of REST and giant global graph and all of these things for a very long time. And of course, there's nothing preventing anybody from taking that and making their own local clone and keeping it. So just like to maybe put a finer point on what you said, it sounds like you're arguing for digital rights management baked into the web for all content everywhere. Would that be a fair statement to say?
I think that is one of the components that we can think about, yes. I don't necessarily, I think that it's not necessarily something Drupal itself should handle, because I think that's potentially really overextending Drupal's mission. But I do believe that there needs to be some mechanism for folks in Drupal to be able to have control over their content and where it ends up.
Okay, so like ultimately that would be some new spec that maybe we don't have today.
And it's something we could potentially write ourselves.
All right. Anybody else got a question?
Hey, Preston.
Hey.
Thanks a lot for very interesting presentation. So it sounds very appealing to decentralize the web, like you say, and put all your own data locally where you are. But what about search engines? Isn't that like a fatal roadblock for this ideal?
It's a very good point. So if you look at some of the thinking that, and some of the scholarship or some of the writing that these open web / decentralized web advocates have done, I mean, the idea really is to kind of not destroy, but at least hobble these search engines from having completely free access to data. And for certain cases, I think if you have public information that is intended to be for public consumption, that should absolutely be searchable. That should absolutely be something that is indexed. But I should be able to, as a user of this search engine, control exactly how my content ends up on that search engine. One good example of this is thinking about some of the recent cases of revenge, what's called certain revenge acts that people have taken, for instance, where they upload images of former romantic partners that are extremely inappropriate in order to ruin their lives. This happened to Jennifer Lawrence, for instance, where now these people have absolutely no recourse to protect themselves from the inevitable harassment that results. And the fact of the matter is that there's no real mechanism for this for Google as well. I mean, if you consider the fact that Twitter, for instance, had no ability to actually take this content and ban it. If, for example, Jennifer Lawrence had the ability to control that content and where it ended up, this would not have happened in the first place. There's a very interesting long-form article that I want to recommend for the people in this room. How many people have heard of Sarah Zhang? She was recently a very important figure on Twitter who was accused of past tweets that were, basically it's a very polarized controversy. But she wrote a very interesting book that is now out of print, but The Verge has reprinted it. It's called The Internet of Garbage. And it talks about the kind of impasse right now between digital rights management over content and free speech on the web. I highly recommend it because it points exactly to the issues that you describe. From my standpoint, I do not believe that someone should be able to take content that they do not own and spread it across the internet and potentially ruin people's lives. And that is something that such local control of data would prevent.
So then, kind of building on that, doesn't this imply that like we need encryption everywhere all the time?
Could be.
Okay.
And that is something that, for example, the blockchain advocates are really in support of. And potentially that is something that we need. But I think the biggest issue with that, right, is, for example, I have family members who barely know how to create passwords or have their passwords on a sticky note on the side of their screen. And how are we going to teach our relatives and those who are not experienced users of the internet about public key cryptography. I mean, it's just impossible. We have to make these mechanisms much easier and easy to use for those individuals who don't understand. And I think that's going to take a lot more education than we have right now.
So then if we bake channels as a first-level citizen of Drupal, as an example, just to kind of bring this back home, and relate it to, say, maybe the question about search engines, then don't we just have like a particular channel that is the one we intend to be public? Do different service providers and/or browsers of our content then have to register as members of that channel each time they visit? Like a new browser opens up to my site, and the browser has to negotiate that with me? Like, is that like an element of this thought?
Yes, I believe so. Okay. I would say that is true. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question or comment. I really wanted to foster a discussion, and this is very, very good so far. Yes, please.
Hey, Preston.
Hey.
Some amazing ideas. It's something I'd love to see in action one day. I think one thing that just popped into my head is that I feel one of the main reasons these pieces of software and all these amazing things like Google Maps, Facebook with their events, organizations, something maybe we're starting to take for granted as we just have it. The reason these things have been possible is quite a lot to do with these companies being able to use our data and being able to harvest and sell our data to fund and research into these projects. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on how that might be managed if actually everybody is able to say, no, you can't do that.
So just to be clear on your question, so it's about these companies, they want to use our data for purposes that are positive.
Positive, but not necessarily something we'd explicitly want, if you kind of understand me?
Right. So things that we don't know about, but are things that are benign, not necessarily.
So yeah, so for example, these are all free, funded by advertising and uses of our private data. Whereas if we had the opportunity, we might turn these things off, but that would actually stop these things being free and open and accessible. Yep.
So that's a very, very good point. So. I'm really glad you brought that up, actually, because that's a slide that I took out of this presentation because I wanted to focus more on the Drupal angle. Okay. There's Rupe Verborg, and by the way, I highly recommend you read that blog post. It's really an incredible piece of work. In that blog post, he talks about the fact that there's going to be a bifurcation of the current technology market into two different segments. The first segment is going to be the creation of applications like we have today. It's going to be the Facebooks, the Googles, all the things that we're used to, Gmail, and whatnot. The second is going to be a market for personal data and personal information. So, for example, let's take the example of a travel site like Flight Center or like Kayak or Expedia, right? They want to know where you've traveled to. They want to know exactly what your itineraries are from place to place because that helps them predict different market conditions and also do that little graph that tells you whether to buy now or to wait. And so the argument is that there's going to be this market for people to have these applications, but there's also going to be a market where we as consumers of those applications can now take this data and make it valuable to others in such a way that, for example, Flight Center or Expedia or whoever will pay us and compensate us for using the data that they want from us. And that, of course, requires a whole new kind of paradigm to begin economically. But that is something that's already begun, actually. If you look at examples, I can't remember the names of the companies off the top of my head, but there are certain companies that are personal information brokers. Some of them are very nefarious, some of them are very damaging, and some of them operate in secret. But there are a couple that are operating under the guise of having the ability for these customers to charge certain amounts for their data. So you can say, my first name is worth 1 cent, my last name is worth 5 cents, and my email address is worth $1.20 or something. None of these companies have taken off in the way that you would expect. But I do think that if we do go in this direction, that is absolutely something that will occur and will need to occur because actually it's really, number one, an important thing for companies to survive off of personal data, because people do need to use that for different services and providing those services. But it also means that we get a little bit of the ability to say, if I'm going to become more of a public figure and I'm going to become more exposed to these environments and have my data used in these ways, I should be getting some of that revenue myself. Because think about this. We're not getting compensated at all by Facebook for the content we put up there, for how we're helping their machine learning algorithms, for how we're helping Google with its natural language processing algorithms. But what if we could be?
Thank you. That's cool.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for. I'll be over here on the side if you want to talk more. Thank you.